Okay, very good day to you. My name is Kenneth, and I'm on the Skype with Phil T. Mistlberger, or PT Mistlberger. He is the author of several books, several excellent books. He's a transpersonal therapist, workshop facilitator. And today we're going to talk about gender. We're going to talk about men and women and more about men. And Phil, first of all, welcome.
Thank you, Ken. Pleasure to talk with you.
Pleasure. Always a pleasure. So, Phil, you started off this conversation with me, really, by sending over an essay that you did about the masculine. And a lot of your transpersonal work has been focused on men, and you run men's groups. You draw on the mythopoetic movement, the men's movement, that has drawn from people like Robert Bly and Jungian psychotherapy. So maybe let's just start with the question of, just to be clear on what it is we're talking about. I think some people are confused with the fact, okay, I'm a man, but does it mean I'm only a man? There's a part of a man that's feminine too, right? Can we talk about that dynamic, that aspect there? Are there men who are more feminine than masculine, and are those what we call, does that lead to more effeminate men, homosexual men? Can you tell us a bit of detail about that dynamic?
Well, a little bit of historical context is helpful here, painting the bigger picture. And for that, you have to sort of look back in history, even a few hundred years ago, prior to, let's say, the 1880s, 1890s. Women did not have the vote politically. They first had the vote in the 1890s, I believe it was in New Zealand, and then the 1920s in parts of Europe and parts of North America. And so prior to that, there's a lot of history of women being politically marginalized and socially marginalized, containing certainly power within the home, or the proverbial power behind the throne, but not outwardly so much, to be sure. There has been a certain legacy of oppression, let's say, of women for the past, you could say, 2,000 years, or indefinitely back into recorded history. There is talk of a matriarchy further back in history, but there's not actually a whole lot of historical evidence for it. It tends to be more conjectural. But certainly in recent times, things have changed. You could say the first wave feminism movement occurred in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and then a second wave that occurred in the 1960s, let's say 1970s, post Second World War, post Cold War era, that whole thing, leading up into what's sometimes recognized as a third wave that occurred in the 1990s, which was more accepting of, let's say, the so-called queer culture, or the greater social acceptance of gender issues that were far outside of the norm or the mainstream, let's say. Now, all that is predictable and commendable on many levels. We are far ahead socially on those levels than we were, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, for sure. But the effect that it's had on men is something that is often not always looked at. And this was the whole idea behind the original men's movement groups as they arose in the 1960s and 1970s. Initially, a lot of these groups were anti-sexist groups, meaning that they were men getting together to support the feminist cause. John Rowan writes about that in his book, The Horned God, which is a really good analysis of the men's movements of the 1960s and 70s as they were taking place in Great Britain in particular. Now, a sort of a reaction occurred to all that around in the 1970s when some men began to realize that they needed to work on their own masculinity in a different way, in a conscious way that wasn't simply supporting the feminist movement. Like an anti-sexist men's groups that were supporting the feminist movement and that had as their agenda the deconstruction of patriarchy on many levels on the planet. By the 1990s, 2000s, and currently where we are now, it's become more and more clear that a lot of that work has been done. Patriarchy in certain respects has been deconstructed. Not to say that it isn't still rampant on the planet. It is in many ways that are not could not be considered to be healthy. It's still alive and well in that sense. But
can we define patriarchy? I find it's a very tricky
which
word.
is important, yes, because patriarchy in the strict etymological sense of the word refers only to the lineage or the structures around the father. But patriarchy, in the sense that I mean it here, is something that is, let's say, contributes to an imbalance between men and women, where women are oppressed or controlled or marginalized, which has been the case for, let's say, a very long time throughout recorded history. But now, since this has been shifting and changing, and that women are less and less in that position, are more and more moving towards the classical ideas of liberation, emancipation, freedom, and empowerment, this has in turn affected relationships and men as well. So, just to simplify here, Gurdjieff, the controversial, very interesting spiritual teacher of the early 20th century, once said that a woman doing transformational work or spiritual work doesn't need to do a whole lot. She just needs to be with a real man. This was his language. She needs to be with a real man, and she will move into her femininity naturally by the process of spiritual surrender into her feminine polarity. But he said the problem was that there were no real men around anymore, or very few real men around. Now, he said this in the 1920s, which was the first wave of feminism. So his idea was that, things like from the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, the idea of Eve emerging from the rib of Adam is an esoteric metaphor for how the masculine precedes the feminine. And in other words, if the masculine is in place, then the feminine flowers naturally. And if that's not the case, then the feminine sort of struggles and ends up taking over the masculine role, which ends up not being good for the masculine or the feminine.
I'm sure some feminists would have something to say about that. It sounds kind of men first, women second.
Well, this is part of it's not like first, second as in more important. It's not like prioritizing their degree of significance or importance. It rather has to do with what is natural, let's say, in a process of coming together. You can think of it as a metaphor as a plant or a tree, where the masculine could be likened to the roots or the trunk of the tree, and the feminine to the branches or the flowers, and the perfume that comes from the flowers. So this has nothing to do with which is more important or which is more significant or anything like that. It has to do with sort of a natural unfolding of events. You could even think of it numerologically as a 1 before a 2 and a 3. It doesn't mean 1 is more important than 2. Okay. Or building of a structure of a pyramid, a base followed by an apex. Arguably the apex, the flowers, the branches are more beautiful than the trunk or the roots, but that doesn't mean they're more important. And because the trunk or the roots performs its particular function doesn't mean it's more important than the branches or the flowers. So that was one of the ideas that he came up with and put forth. And this seems to actually hold out for a lot of gender psychology when you look at these issues of what causes relationships to falter and not flourish. It's often related to one or both sides not actualizing the potentials of their gender, let's say. So if the man is quote unquote not doing his job, or if the woman is quote unquote not doing her job, to do the job of the masculine, to do the job of the feminine, and how that comes together in a certain alchemy that produces something higher, let's say. And so the idea there was that if the masculine is not comfortable in his masculinity, if a man is not grounded in his masculinity, he's not good in relationship. And so the woman never gets a chance to surrender into her femininity. because she's always wearing the pants in the relationship, or she's taking over roles that would best be left to the masculine, and so she has a harder time embracing her own femininity. Either that, or we're creating some strange culture of androgynous people that are sort of constantly overlapping roles. But is all this good? Is all this healthy? And in my own work as a transpersonal counselor, I'm constantly working with couples that show this dysfunction that really boils down to one or both sides not having embraced their own gender, and all that involves. So there's some of the basic ideas that, and when I run men's groups, the topic of the feminine or women will come up from time to time, but it's not the main issue. The main issue is, what does it mean to be masculine?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be
That's
grounded?
what I wanted to ask, actually. What is a mature man? What are aspects of the mature masculinity?
Well, it's helpful to look and see, first of all, what are some of the symptoms of when it's not there.
Okay.
And this is some of the stuff that Bly wrote about in Iron John, which is, that myth of the hairy wild man in the woods, that all these men are going off into the woods and disappearing, and one day the king sends an expedition out there to find out where all the men are disappearing to, and he discovers there's a hairy wild man under a lake that is grabbing all these men and taking them away. And the hairy wild man is symbolic of that initiator that comes for younger men, in the form of an older man usually, and he's not necessarily the father. He's someone often sort of mysterious, symbolic presence. And so one of the symptoms of a man whose masculine core is compromised or damaged or unhealed is that he doesn't trust older men. He's constantly on red alert. He's constantly suspicious about older men and the structures of power in the world, most of which are run by older men. And so such a man has a tendency to sort of disappear into the sands of time, let's say, and his talents and abilities are never actualized or known by the world, because he spends half of his energy fighting against the ghosts of the past, in the form of, what I sometimes call the clunky, rusty armor of older men. And why does he do that? Why is he unhealed with older men? Because he's not very connected to his father. That's where it begins, right? So before the Industrial Revolution, men tended to take their sons places. If they went to work, or if they went hunting, or if they went on an expedition, very often the son would come with them, or at least would know what they're doing. Since the Industrial Revolution, men have been off in offices and factories, and the son often doesn't know what they're doing. And one of the ideas is, when a boy doesn't know what his father's doing, he fills in the blank in his mind with something. He fills it in his mind, and it's usually what he fills it in with is something negative. So he imagines his father isn't doing something positive. He becomes allegiant to the feminine. He leans much more into his mother. Basically, analysis that speaks to this, which I think carries a lot of weight, is that a young boy growing up doesn't differentiate between himself and his mother until roughly the age of 6 or 8 or 10, where he begins to become more and more obvious that he's one gender and she's another gender. She's a girl and he's a boy, and that's the time where he's supposed to start identifying with his father, or perhaps older brothers or uncles if he has them. But if the connection with the father is weak, if the father's not very present, if he's tired all the time, if he's irritated, if he's not very just not present, either physically or emotionally, then the young boy doesn't identify very well with the father. His identification process is weak, and it never fully happens. So he remains emotionally allegiant to the female, to the mother, to the feminine. And so then in growing up, men for him become largely objects of competition. He derives his sustenance and his well-being from the female. And so he learns to be very strategic in his dealings with women, because they're very important to him. If he's charming, if he's blessed with good looks or charm, then he might become controlling in certain ways, and adept at that. If he doesn't have these attributes, then he more perhaps resenting the feminine and holding them accountable for things in his mind. But either way, because he's not connected to the masculine, he he overemphasizes the importance of the feminine in his mind. So he might become destructively angry towards them, or he might become very skilled at controlling and manipulating them, or whatever it is. But either way, the basic problem is the connection with the masculine.
Did you see, I think you briefly mentioned something about the internet and how we live in an age full of distractions. And this is, it seems, very much attached to young men these days who maybe don't have a particular kind of focus or find it very difficult to settle on something to do, something, back to the idea that I guess the masculine core is to go out and contribute to the world in some way, shape, or fashion.
Yes, a man's work is very important, and you hear it said in most of the literature, men's movement literature, Robert Bly, Sam Keen, David Deida, and so forth, that a man needs to prioritize his work over his relationships. And I've come to find that to be very true. So when a man is not passionate about his work, when he doesn't have a dragon to slay, when he doesn't have something to sink his teeth into in terms of his work life, he ends up not doing very well in a relationship. And so for the man that prioritizes his woman over his work, he then ends up not doing very well in either. Doesn't do very well in his work, and he doesn't do very well in a relationship. And this sometimes appears counterintuitive, because a man commonly might experience from his woman the message coming towards him that she wants him to prioritize her, to make her, the sort of romantic ideal of making your woman feel like she's the only woman in the universe, like she's special and all that. But this is something very distinct from putting her ahead of your work life. The man that puts the woman ahead of his work life may win temporary battles, but he usually loses the war. And the war not being with the woman, the war being with himself and with his life. So his life tends to not stagnate, deteriorate, and even times outright collapse when he's not passionately engaging himself in his life. And sometimes referred to as a man, when he engages himself in his work, then it can be seen like this: the woman actually will trust him more because she sees that he is committed to his life. This is not the same thing as being a workaholic. I'm not talking about that, because that's a distinct sort of anomalous aspect of all this. If a man becomes a workaholic, sometimes some things in his relationship, that's something different. But if a man is not passionately into his work life, it translates to the woman as he's not committed at certain levels. And so she might even end up feeling less trust for him. Whereas a man who's very dedicated to his work in his life actually is, generally speaking, more trustworthy to a woman because she respects his strength and so forth. So men need to sort of navigate this whole thing, because they may at times appear like they're getting mixed messages from the woman, that she wants him to prioritize her, but he knows he needs to prioritize his work. But if he does prioritize his work, more often than not, far more often than not, the woman will respect him and will end up feeling more comfortable with him and trusting towards him anyway. So,
Phil, I'm really curious about this. So, I guess the theory is that every person has feminine and masculine qualities. And I guess here, implicitly, we are assuming that all men have a more masculine essence than they have a feminine essence. Is that an assumption that we're making here?
Well, I wouldn't put it like that. You could put it more like, let's say, the standard way of putting it is 80 or 90% of men have more of a masculine essence because they're heterosexual men, whereas you could say gay men are wired differently in that regard. If you want to think of that in terms of 10 or 20% of the population, probably closer to 10%, I would imagine, who have, let's say, more of a feminine essence. But even then, two gay people together, men or women, one often embodies more of the masculine polarity and one the feminine polarity, regardless of their biological gender. So no, I would not say all men have a predominantly masculine essence probably 80 or 90% do.
Okay.
So yeah, go ahead.
No, actually, because I guess the other tangent is the New Age movement, which we've talked about before. And, I'm calling from the Bay Area, where there is a certain amount of New Age influence. And I guess, around my age group, or say 20s to 30s, there are a lot of men who are sort of immersed in that New Age movement. And I guess this is conflated with all that we've said before, the lack of initiation, the lack of good father figures. And I guess that this is another factor of the feminization of a lot of younger men, would you say?
Well, yeah, it's sometimes referred to as the naive ascending man. I mean, the New Age had as its basis a very noble idea, which is syncretism, bringing together all the highest wisdom traditions on the planet and distilling them from their basis. But unfortunately, the shadow side of the New Age is what I call feel-good spirituality, which is an attempt to reduce anxiety at all costs. So that's the primary thing of it, and there involves a lot of spiritual bypassing,
Yes.
overlooking the shadow side of
I agree with that.
psyche. In my own men's groups, we do we do a fair amount of shadow work, which is looking at the darker side of the male psyche, which can be nasty and intense, and tends to be evident in a man's life when he hasn't come to terms with it, isn't accepting it. So we do a lot of the shadow work of stepping back and looking at that darker nature. And this is not something you find in most traditional, New Age work is not so much about that. It tends to be more about rushing headlong into the light, and unfortunately ignoring the darker aspects while doing so. So inevitably you end up getting this sort of disconnected, disembodied person. And in men in particular, this becomes something I would say very unappealing. The disconnected man whose head is in the clouds and his feet are not on planet Earth. I've always thought that women can pull that one off better than men. So a New Age woman for me was always something a little more natural. The New Age man is particularly strange specimen in some ways, because not only is he disconnecting from his shadow, he's also disconnecting from his masculinity in a lot of ways. Certainly in my own work with men, we take a good look at that. What does it mean to disconnect or to dissociate from one's darker nature and pretend that it's not there? And or project and judge men who seem to be embodying that, such as, say, successful businessmen, or even darker types like aberrant types or criminal types or what have you, which has nothing to do with sympathizing with them, certainly endorsing them, but it has to do with recognizing, is there a criminal inside of you? Is there a power monger inside of you? Is there an abusive person inside of you? Are you in touch with this person? Are you in touch with this part of your nature? Everything that goes with it. So the work is really about getting in touch with. And when men do this, say in a circle with other men, where there are no women in the room, it's a very different process than when men do this when there are women in the room. Because when men do this when there are women in the room, they tend to be much more affected by the women than the other way around. I often use this analogy: if you have 10 men in a room, you bring in one woman, it doesn't matter who she is, the chemistry will change quite radically. If you do the reverse, you have 10 women together in a circle, you bring in one man, unless he's some extraordinary man, not much is going to change, because the women tend to remain connected.
It's interesting.
Women are like water. I mean, so in a lot of ways they flow into each other, and men are more like fire, or you could say air, which the traditional elements, air and fire, were masculine, earth and water were feminine. And men connect in very different ways, but generally speaking, they tend to be very sensitive to the change of chemistry when the feminine enters the picture. And so when men are alone in a circle, processing just with each other, they have the opportunity, the potential to go much deeper and much, much darker as well, which is one of the reasons why I think women have often been suspicious of men getting together, and for good reason, because men can become very dark when they're alone together, when there isn't a greater context, a greater understanding of what the purpose of this all is, which there certainly is in the circles, the men's circles that I run. Without that greater understanding, that greater context, men can reinforce each other's darkness without any consciousness. But shadow work is not the same as reinforcing darkness. Shadow work is understanding the darkness so that you're not run by it, so you're not driven by it, and so you're not repressing it either.
Now, actually, this is that's a very good, interesting idea, that actually bringing one woman to a group of 10 men, vice versa. From David Deida's work, actually, I realized that presence is such an important masculine trait. This ability to focus and to be present, not to be flustered by things. Can you talk a little bit about why? Do you agree, first of all, and why is that such a masculine trait? Is it just to hold space for something to happen, or is it to be open to one's environment, to be more centered within oneself, or what is that?
Well, yeah. I mean, traditionally, if you take this back to, say, the tantric teachings of the East, there's this idea of Shiva and Shakti. Shiva associated with the mountain or spaciousness, and Shakti with the wind or pure energy. So one of the ideas is for a woman to come into her full actualization is to be alive like the wind or like spontaneous energy, and for the masculine to come into his greater potential is to be able to hold space like the mountain. Having said that, I will say, and we've talked about this before, like I acknowledge Deida's writings. He's a good writer, and my one concern with him is that he tends to emphasize somewhat the behavior aspect of how a man should behave with a woman. Which sometimes is almost like seems like a sort of a more rarefied version of Robert Greene's Art of Seduction, let's say, where the primary concern is the effect that a man can have on a woman and what he has to do for that. The reason why I prefer Robert Bly to David Deida is that Bly is more concerned with the masculinity in and of itself. Not so much how a man should behave towards a woman, although he does talk about that on occasion, but what does it mean to be a man? And I think that does reflect back with the question you were asking me about the holding space. So the idea is that when a man is in his center, he is able to hold space for a woman naturally, and so is able to, for example, not take things on as much, or not take things so personally, or not be so reactive. Because when a man isn't comfortable in his masculine core, he tends to be very reactive. So to emphasize another point here, to be in your masculine core doesn't mean you're insensitive. In fact, the sensitivity could go to a very high level, but it's not the same thing as being easily threatened in one's identity. So the spaciousness is there to allow the female to be highly expressive. Like the wind or like pure energy, and not be threatened by that. But the main agenda is you're not doing that for the sake of the female. You're doing it because this is what it is to be masculine. And this is the fine point I have here between Bly and Deida, and why I prefer Bly, because he also wrote the book in his 60s, whereas Deida's book, Way of the Superior Man, was written in his 30s. So that there was a difference for me in the ages of the two men. Where one was a little more concerned about the effect that men were having on the female, and what they had to do in order to get the best reaction from the female, whereas the other had sort of grown beyond that and realized that that's not what this was ultimately about. The sooner the man gets the idea and the understanding that what's important is to become acquainted with his own masculinity through his connection with his father and with the community of older men, then the less important is how he, the whole aspect of how he behaves with women becomes less important, because he doesn't have to worry about focusing so much in that area. It will sort of happen naturally, that he will be at his optimum with women if he is comfortable in his own masculinity.
This is okay. I'm sorry to bring it to this kind of depth, but this is, I think, an important question. Now I guess I think of it in terms of we're talking about non-duality in some elements of this, because you're saying, okay, it doesn't matter what goes on, but don't identify with that. If something is, say, for example, my partner is pushing all my buttons, right? So there's a kind of, I'm witnessing all of this happening, but I'm not identifying with my ego and such that I don't defend. Now, would you say that element or that path is more of a masculine path, this ability to not react, or is that more of a dynamic of the ego versus the true self or the Atman, whatever you want to call it?
Well, it's a dynamic of the ego, but masculine and feminine psychology is different, and we're talking about the masculine, so that's sort of what I'm focusing on. And I can, experientially, I can only speak from that area because I am male. Having said that, there is, of course, the non-dual paradigm, and all of that implies, and we've talked about this before, obviously. The natural question is, what's the point of doing all this gender work if one is interested in transcending duality? And this is the question that I faced 25 years ago, because in my original journey in the 1980s, I was in India, and I was involved in some of what I consider some of the the highest non-dual teachings on the planet, such as Zen Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, all the schools of Buddhism and Vedanta, basically. And then in the early 1990s, someone mentioned a men's group to me. And my first reaction was, I don't need this.
Yeah.
What am I going to go here for? This feels like regressing. But I trusted the guy that was talking to me about this, and the guy that ultimately enrolled me into this men's training in the early 1990s. And I did it because instinctively I sensed there was something there for me. And did I ever find out there was something there for me? Big time. Mm-hmm. I realized I began to see very clearly all these parts of my development that I'd overlooked, that I had bypassed, essentially, in my headlong rush to reach the light of non-duality and the brilliance of transcendence and all of that. I was transcending my own humanity in many ways, and the lessons of duality.
Yeah.
Because there's non-duality, all is one, and then there is a spirituality within a duality as well, which is enjoying the contrasts. If the weather is the same all the time, it's kind of dull. But when you get a variety of weather, it makes it kind of interesting. It's the same thing with when we go out for dinner. Why don't we just eat hamburgers all the time, right? Why do we enjoy salad with the hamburger? Why do we enjoy savory with sweet? Because part of the pleasures of duality are the contrasts. And this tends to get overlooked in teachings on when people exclusively focus on non-duality. The other thing is that you can't transcend something until you know it. And this is the most important thing. Ken Wilber, all the integral philosophers really emphasize this point. Going back to Hegel in the early 19th century, which is that in order to move beyond something, you need to know it first. So you cannot transcend the ego until you know your ego first. It's very difficult to transcend duality and gender duality until you're first comfortable within your own gender. In other words, in order to become an enlightened man, you first need to be a man. In order to become an enlightened woman, you first need to be a woman, and all that entails, and understanding that. So that was the important realization for me personally, was that I saw where I was bypassing parts of my own psychological development in my headlong rush into the spiritual. And then the other thing is that when you go back and you investigate the dualism, let's say the masculine or the feminine if you're a woman, you discover all this extraordinary spirituality that is within that as well. So there's a type of bonding that men and women can have when they're concerned, when their focus is on transcending duality, like in satsang gatherings, let's say, the Vedanta tradition. And then there's a type of bonding that occurs between men alone, or between women alone. the sisterhood or the brotherhood, which is also extraordinary and has many deeply spiritual qualities to it, to be embraced and realized. So I discovered that I was not at all regressing. I was simply enriching my experience, and embracing the reality that we are born into a universe of dualities, even if the ultimate ground of it all is to recognize the non-duality of it all. You can enjoy both, and they need not be a problem in terms of embracing the two together.
I mean, just thinking about duality, I mean, this is the masculine, feminine polarity is such a big one to work with in terms of archetype. I mean, it's something that essentially you can work on this one for forever towards wherever it is that you're going spiritually.
You can, and the journey's to be enjoyed. I think the only problem arises when we think in terms of we need to come to the end of the journey. Where is it going to end? Right? When am I going to be there? It's like Immanuel Kant pointed out in the 18th century in his Critique of Pure Reason, that space and time are constructs of the mind. Right? So we get hung up in this idea of when is it going to end? What's the point of doing this when I'm supposed to be at point B? I'm at point A. When am I going to get to point B? Well, this is really just a construct of the mind. You could say in the greater reality, there is no space and time. There's just this simple, spontaneous, continuous unfolding of things. And so the sooner we sort of get that, the more we can enjoy the journey without worrying, when the journey is going to be over, and when we're going to get to this abstract point B where everything is done, and then now what? That sort of thing. Right? So it's more like just dealing with what is now, what the Buddha called Tathagata suchness, the suchness of this moment, and embracing that, and the reality that goes with it. So you're male, this much you know. So what does it mean to be male? You're human, you know this also. You're conscious, you know that. What does it mean to be all these things? But I don't think it's necessary to reject anything that's in front of us in terms of our condition, the condition we find ourselves to be in.
So I'm just gonna, what comes to my mind, what I'm interested in is Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette wrote King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, which is obviously a very famous book in the men's literature movement and draws from Carl Jung. So, when I when I'm out and I'm really attracted to guys who I have a lot of respect for guys who have their shit together. He's got stuff handled down, he's successful, he handles himself well. There's a kind of aspect of mastery that's associated with the king archetype. I'm hoping you could speak about that and how we can move towards that kind of archetype.
Yeah, well, in Moore and Gillette's ideas as they presented them, the lover was the one who knows how to connect with through intimacy, and the magician is the creative aspect, the warrior is the disciplined part of you, and then the king is the one who brings it all together. So the king is like the opposite of the jack of all trades, master of none. Mm-hmm. The king is the one that really emphasizes completion, let's say. Mm-hmm. You can think of this in the tarot deck of the 22 trumps or greater arcana. The last one is the world, and the world represents the end of the journey, which is what the king also represents. The feminine version of that would be the queen, in the true sense of that. So the king is the key to the king is completion. So when a man starts a project or starts something and he doesn't finish it, which is a problem, especially in the era we live in now, what I call the 21st century distracted man era, which is where we have so much information that is coming at us at once now, largely because of cell phone technology and the internet. We're like the proverbial kids in candy stores all the time. There's just so much to do and so many possibilities, and so this really enhances things like attention deficit symptoms and what have you. where there's this failure to complete things. And you look at back in the, if you look back in some of the older traditions, say some of the martial art traditions, you remember the show in the early 1970s with David Carradine, Kung Fu, where he played this character, Kwai Chang Caine. And a lot of this was based on, very real research that they had done in researching for this show. The Shaolin Temple, the first scene, they show these young boys, roughly around the age of 10 or 12 or something, that are orphans, and they're hoping to be taken in by the Shaolin Monastery, where they would eventually be trained to be Kung Fu masters. And in the opening scene, there's 10 or 12 of them standing outside in a rainstorm. And after 2 or 3 days, most of them have scattered and gone. And so at the end of the week or so, there's 1 or 2 or 3, I think 3 boys remaining, and they get invited in by one of the monks to come into the monastery and have tea, and then a few of them fail their next test, which was to not drink tea before the master drank the tea. And so they're all thrown out. They're all thrown out except for our hero, Kwai Chang, who waited to drink his tea after the master drank his tea. And then because he passed all the tests. So in other words, the moral of that story was that he only got into that monastery by enduring, by completing what was in front of him. He had to complete his stay outside in the rainstorms before he could get into the monastery. Then he had to complete by being patient, not drinking his tea before the master drank his tea. And in completing all these tests, he was then admitted to the next level. So it's a great metaphor for what happens when we don't complete things in life. In terms of the greater picture of a man, when he doesn't complete things in life, he always remains in this prince mode, this boy mode. He never transitions from prince to king. Or I actually have several different levels there in my own school, which I call the Samurai Brotherhood for men. We have the boy, the prince, the knight, and then the captain, and so forth, and eventually, you get into a general or a king. These are like different stages of development. But the outstanding feature about the prince is this sense of entitlement. He always expects things to come towards him. He doesn't have to generate it of his own accord, and this is because he's not completing lessons. So the sooner we get in the habit from an early age of completing things, then the sooner the man makes that transition from prince to, knight is essentially a young man who's more in his own power, and then eventually into higher levels. Let's say the king being the one who has real tangible accomplishments in life, and so has the self-esteem that goes with those accomplishments. Just feeling good about himself. He feels good about himself because he's finished things. So that's the, as I understand it, that's the essence of the king archetype, is this ability to complete tasks that are put in front of us.
Okay, I struggle with this, but isn't there a certain room for experimentation? How why would you, sort of waste time completing something that your heart is not into anymore?
Yeah, but by completing things doesn't mean that you're not adaptable. It's not like completing things like a robot. Obviously, if you're working at something that, say, I remember when I was in Egypt years ago and I got to see the pyramids. There is this famous pyramid called the Bent Pyramid, which is, I think it's about 10 miles south of Giza, where the Great Pyramid is, or 20 miles south. And it literally was built like this, and then they changed the slope of it at the top. So the top is like this, and the second half is down like that. So it's literally like a bent pyramid. And the reason it's bent is because the historians conjecture that the original angle wasn't working. The whole thing was in danger of collapsing. So they altered it. They changed the angle. There are also ruins there of rubble, of pyramids that just totally collapsed because they were built in a wrong fashion. We tend to see only the one, we see the Great Pyramid, which was successful. They got that one right, and the ones around it. But a lot of them, there's over 150 pyramids in Egypt, and some of them are just ruins because they either weren't built well, or something was wrong with the angle. So it's certainly possible to make mistakes in life, and it is necessary sometimes to change course. But that still doesn't mean you're not completing things. It just means you're adapting yourself in a way that's called for, and but you're still seeing it through.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know if that speaks to what you were asking.
No, I think that's a good qualifier.
Yes, it's not that this idea of completion is not the same thing as being rigid or single-minded in a way that's just stubborn and stupid. Like in the creation of dogma, let's say, or perpetuating dogma.
Yeah. I guess there's a kind of seriousness to it too, right? I mean, astrologically, I don't know how much you are into astrology. Obviously, Saturn is a big kind of mastery, completion, and getting things handled kind of archetype.
Saturn is about responsibility.
Yeah.
Like Jupiter is
Expansion.
Jupiter's about joyousness and expansion. Jupiter's is let's have a party, and Saturn is the one that says in the morning we have to clean up the mess. So Saturn is associated with old man time, this guy with the scythe, the Grim Reaper.
Yeah.
And astrology, there's the idea of the Saturn return, 28, 29 years of age, and again in one's later 50s, 56, 57, which is where I am right now. So I'm in entering my second Saturn return. And it's a metaphor for accountability and responsibility, right? So, like the first Saturn return is really about differentiating from your family of origin. It's recognizing that you're now an individual person. You're not just an outgrowth of your family.
Yeah.
And when one doesn't make that shift or that recognition, certainly for a man, you stay in that prince mode, sense of entitlement, always expecting to be taken care of by others, to be fed energy. Whereas the shift, the Saturn return, is all about accountability.
Do you think some degree of suffering is always necessary initiation? I'm thinking to, obviously initiations of shamans, for example, where, boys are taken out and they have to perform all sorts of incredible tasks, and, there's a certain amount of encounter with death, in a way. Would you say that's essential?
Yeah, it's always been part of the standard initiation of the shaman in many traditions, was to acquire a helping spirit or a familiar, and this found its stereotype in the medieval idea of the witch with a cat, right? That's where this actually comes from. The helping spirit is a shamanic idea of a part of your nature that is activated and that will help you to, let's say, manifest things in life. But the basis of it is encountering a difficult side of your own nature. So this is found in mythology, or in religious tradition, where Jesus, for example, goes into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, and who shows up but Satan, who tries to tempt him, right? And he has to resist that temptation to prove his quality. The Buddha under the banyan tree, when he's going through his awakening, who shows up but Mara, the Buddhist devil, to tempt him. And the Buddha has to resist this, again, to show his quality. And shamanic tradition often involves going out into the wilds, let's say, or a period of isolation, in which you encounter a part of your own nature that can be quite difficult or even scary or challenging. And the idea is to sort of wrestle with it or grapple with it, come to terms with it, not be dominated by it, and ultimately integrate it. So it becomes part of your greater nature, but you're not controlled by it. At this point, it's now serving you. And I have undergone some of this stuff myself. I did a 1-month retreat once in the wilds, not quite under a tree. I had a cabin. It was a little more modern, but the same thing happened to me. After 4 weeks of isolation, I encountered difficult parts of my own psyche, and then there was a happy ending to it in my case, because I was able to experience a higher level of that, which was quite blissful. But it wouldn't have been possible if I hadn't demonstrated that willingness to face into that part of my nature. So that's traditionally what the shamanic initiation and retreat is about. And it does involve, as you mentioned, a certain level of suffering. The idea is that we can't get out of this situation we're in without sort of backtracking and coming back the way we started. So if we find ourselves in a mess, there's no avoiding the fact that we have to go back to the origin point and see how this mess started in the first place. Standard way of putting that is, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. It's like the Gnostic version of this universe. No perfect God would have created this universe because it is imperfect. It was created by a demiurge or an architect who was essentially a very powerful being that is somewhat flawed. Now, it doesn't matter whether you take that literally or not, or if you even believe in it. It's a useful metaphor for understanding how we are the architects of the world we live in. So even with all its flaws and imperfections, we are part of that. And so how do we get out of that without facing into our own challenging parts of our own nature? Or as the Buddha said in his teaching, the first noble truth is life is suffering. In other words, you can't get out of this whole thing if you don't first acknowledge your own suffering, your own pain that is inherent to your condition. The contraction of the ego has to be faced into. And every spiritual warrior, every shaman must face this part of their own nature that is problematic. There's no gliding over it.
Do you think there's some men who are probably more suited to doing this work on their own and not joining a men's group?
Sure. I mean, everyone's different. I've tended to find over the years that it's a little more difficult to do the work on your own. So even the training of a shaman or a warrior, they always had mentors or there's some sort of a community. Sometimes it was only one person, but generally speaking, the more you have around you, as in a community of people that are interested in waking up, the more mirrors you have around you, reflections of your own nature. So more ways you have of seeing yourself, of seeing the bigger picture. It's like, just think of the space probe that when we're doing this right now, that space probe New Horizons is just visiting Pluto at this very moment after a 9-year journey, and it's got a bunch of cameras on it, and it has to train these cameras in different angles of the planet as it goes by and get all these different views of it, different shots of it. So the multiple cameras or different shots of something is sort of a good metaphor for community. When you're involved with others, when you're doing your inner journey with others, they provide sort of different angles through which to see yourself. The difficulty.
So close to window. This noise. Go on. Sorry.
The difficulty of working on your own is there can be more of a temptation to overlook more difficult parts of your nature, what Gurdjieff called the blind spots. Right? So the blind spots are and the major blind spot is sometimes referred to as the chief feature, which is the chief feature of your ego is the main self-saboteur inside of yourself. Now this part tends to get provoked in intimate relationship, which is why the intimate relationship partner is often referred to as the best bullshit detector, your best bullshit detector. Unfortunately, it gets amplified by projection, so that's when you get conflict or craziness in relationship, is that you're no longer bullshit detector for each other, now you're accuser and trial and judge for each other. But the chief feature, the most difficult part of the ego, tends to get flushed out through relationship. So avoiding a relationship has never been the way of awakening. Even monks, that practice, celibate monks in monasteries live together generally in community with each other for a reason. So, there's such a thing as a solitary retreat, for sure. Solitary retreats, I just described one I did to you, that I did for myself in the past, a month-long retreat once. They're very valuable, but in the long run, you're in a relationship with others. So if a man is interested in working on himself in this context, it can be very useful to be part of a community of men that are also doing this.
So, just as we're starting to wrap this up, what happens in a men's group?
Well, if you're asking about my own men's groups, which is what I can tell you. I was involved in other communities also, of course, but I've been running them myself for over 20 years now, and a lot of things take place. none of which I can tell you about.
Why did you have to kill me?
I'm just kidding. We actually, there is a confidentiality agreement, which is important, right?
Okay.
So, reason being that men will often unload material in a men's group that they would be concerned about talking about in other places. But when the context is healing and growth, it's something very different. But there's a degree of sharing that goes on. It's not the same thing as groups where men and women are present, because there's less focus on feelings. Men need to acknowledge feelings and they need to work through them, but they need particularly to look at actions in their lives. How are they acting? I have this system called the Code of the Conscious Warrior. And the very first code is to make your word good, to communicate direct and straight in most cases in life, and to honor your word and to be honorable in that way. And so this is more concerned with action. So the neurotic aspect of the masculine is too much emphasis on action and completely overriding feelings, right? The neurotic aspect of the feminine is overindulgence in feelings and neglecting actions. So, so for a man to ignore feelings altogether is neurotic, but for a man to wallow in feelings, he's becoming feminized. So for a man, and this is fairly common in the era that we live in. So for a lot of men, the awakening or healing process involves learning to be more decisive in his life, to make his word count, and to let the focus be on action in his life. What is he actually doing? Acknowledging feelings, of course, but so in men's groups, we don't sit around doing a lot of emphasis. There's not a lot of emphasis on the feelings and the interpersonal dynamics between people in the group. How do I feel about you, sort of thing, which is really more, say, the province of interpersonal processing when there are men and women in a group together. Men will, the main function of men in a group is to hold each other accountable. What's happening in your life? What are you doing about this right now? Now, in my own groups, we do shadow work, which is exploring some of the darker side of the psyche, the male psyche, and putting that out in the open so men can sort of expose that side to each other. But this is not the same thing of how I feel about you. Sometimes there can be feedback that a man will give to other men in a group, but the emphasis is a bit different. The overriding emphasis in men's groups is, how is this benefiting your life? So, yeah.
Great. Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about in this area. We just covered some of it right now. These are some of the generals, the generalities of the whole picture. But, I would just say that we live in a time in which my experience is that there are many younger men are kind of lost and trying to find their own ways. As it so happens right now in my own men's groups, I'm working with a lot of men from the millennial generation, which is those born after roughly 1982. Yeah. So the Gen Xers were about 1964 to 1982, and then the millennials 1982 up to about 2000. And then you have a whole new generation now that I believe it's referred to as Generation Z or Z, which is those born after 2000, 2001. They're all still young right now. But the millennials are the ones now mostly in their 20s up to about the age of 30. And it's a whole different era because they were raised on the internet.
Yeah.
And now, of course, cell phone technology, the whole Facebook social networking phenomenon, which is something very different. And my experience with millennials is that they tend to be very good communicators. One of my older friends referred to them as dolphins. The millennials are natural communicators, but what they're working with, many of the men, is a precarious economic foundation and questions about what they're supposed to do in the world. Now, I'm a baby boomer because I was born, before, in the late 1950s. And the baby boomers were in reaction to the war generation before that. So we were all about individualism, and there was a stronger economic basis at that time. Real estate was very cheap, whereas young people now spend a great deal of their money just on rental or mortgage. So it's a different situation. But I find that the millennial generation, in some ways, has a tendency to be feminized because of the emphasis of social networking that we have now, which is a very feminine mode of communication. And some things are good about that, some things are not so good about it. And part of what's not so good about it is many men lose their masculine core and need to rediscover it again, what that even is.
Yeah.
So this is where men's groups are very useful, because the focus is on that and what it means to live from one's masculine core.
Yeah. Well, it's such a tricky issue, because I think when you mentioned that, men need to be more decisive and, I guess, less attached to their feelings, I actually had that feeling like, wow, that's surprising to me, because I would say in general, I actually feel that men need to acknowledge their feelings more than to be decisive. I mean, that seems to be more of a priority. If we're talking in general with men, it's like 3.5 billion people on the planet. But I guess it speaks to balance, and how different generations are different.
Well, you have to, hold in mind cultural context, right?
Yeah.
So, if you're dealing with, say, Asian men, or in Asia, or men in Africa, or men in the Far East, or other parts of the world, you have to respond to the cultural sort of parameters of that and how men are there and what they need there. I can only speak to you in terms of what I deal with, in the city that I live in, which is, Pacific Northwest. The experience I have of men and the surroundings I live in, certainly with younger men, are not men that are out of touch with feelings. This is not my experience. Many of them are well in touch with their feelings, but many of them are not very decisive.
Yeah.
And many of them are not on track in their lives in terms of what their higher calling is in the world. And certainly many of them are not very healed with their fathers. But many of them are very sympathetic towards the feminine, and so forth. Now, in other parts of the world, you'll find something different. So I think it depends on which culture you're speaking to. I can only speak to you about my experience with men in this day and age, and in the circles in which I move. Which, of course, the circles in which I move are related to personal growth work, right? And men that are interested in personal growth work tend to be magician types. Or lover types, or men that already have a certain spiritual sensitivity, right? So they don't usually have a problem with feeling, but they often have a problem with, handling stuff in their life and getting untracked for their higher destiny.
Great. Well, Phil, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. I really recommend people to check out his work, his books, his many excellent books, and also check out the workshops that he runs. Phil personally has been a role model for me in terms of the mature masculine. So, in many ways, I owe a debt to you for showing me what the path of the mature masculine is. So thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Always a pleasure to talk to you.